Michael, for joining us on our second episode on the Educators of Today podcast. As I mentioned to you, this is a new podcast where we want to highlight educators in Canada and beyond. And I'm so grateful to be having this conversation with you. And thank you so much for joining.
Thanks, Ziyaan. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Awesome. So to start us off, obviously you've been an educator since 1992, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
I'm curious to learn what inspired you to pursue this path, and how has your journey in education shaped who you are today as Michael?
Well, I'll be honest with you, Ziyaan. I wasn't a big fan of elementary school. I actually hated elementary school. But when I got to a public high school, I was in the Catholic system. When I went to a public high school, White Oak Secondary School. I had some amazing teachers there, like amazing, and I was very inspired by them. And I thought I was thinking about teaching or law, but I have to say that was one of the things I wanted to do. I really felt that a lot of those teachers had a really positive impact on me, and I really enjoyed high school a lot to a large degree because of that. So
Yeah.
in terms of how it shaped how I am today, I think they were a really good example of they were knowledgeable. But they were also kind and compassionate, and they were inclusive. They were very much ahead of their time, and they also knew how to kind of engage you and get you interested, whether it was English or history. I was really. I even remember doing. My one grade 12 English teacher, who was Mr. McBurney, who had such a great sense of humor. We had to do speeches, and my speech was actually a parody of his class. So
Oh.
it was a high risk. It was a high risk sort of assignment because I was being graded on this, but he loved it, and it got a lot of laughs. But it was a compliment to him, obviously. But he was only one of many great teachers I had. So I would say they set a high bar for me going into this profession.
No, I love that. I love that. I love the story that you mentioned, Mr. McBurney. I feel like, yeah, that was definitely a little risky, but it sounds like it turned out really well.
Yeah, it
So,
paid off. It paid off. So yeah.
I love that. I love that. And I know you mentioned a little bit about doing English and history when you first went to U of T, right? Curious how you made that decision, and then at what point did you decide that you wanna pursue a Bachelor of Education at Queens?
I think I was there was a lot of concern back then that should I go into teaching? I wanted to be marketable.
Mm.
I had a deep interest in both English and history and classics and philosophy, but I knew that English and history would probably be fairly marketable in terms of going into secondary. I definitely wanted to be a secondary teacher, so I was thinking ahead at the time, and so I decided to go for the combined history and English specialist.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, while I was at UTM, instead of reading my Victorian novels, I was reading philosophy on the side. So that helped me later on when I ended up teaching the philosophy course. But when I was doing the degree, I think I was concerned because I was thinking either if I go into teaching, I have both of those teachables, and if I try to go into law, then I think those are good preparation for as a pre-law degree.
Makes sense. Makes sense. And you mentioned, your interest in philosophy. Any like philosophers that you've looked up to, or specific philosophies that you like, values that you specifically subscribe to and have been a big fan of since your time studying?
Uh, that's a tough one. I mean, I was interested in a lot of the I mean, I got interested later on when I was teaching philosophy in Bertrand Russell, and I really, when I was in school, obviously I found, a lot of the continental existentialists really interested in like Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and Heidegger. But I like reading. I found it really interesting. So I started buying a lot of philosophy books and just reading them on my own and not doing my homework for my courses. So, but they were good because when you have to teach it yourself later on, and I didn't have a lot of courses. I only had 3 courses in my degree in philosophy, so I just did a
Well,
lot of my own reading and research to be able to teach it to students in high school. So
yeah, no, that makes sense. And it sounds like even when you were a student, like that personal responsibility and drive and leadership was a big part of your journey. And I know this is something that you emphasize as a principal in your school. Curious to learn if there's any like personal experiences where you have had in your journey. Obviously you are in a leadership position, but why is that so important, especially for young people of today?
Um, because I think that a lot of young people do have leadership potential, but they're not noticed. They're undervalued, and sometimes they're underdogs. A lot of young people see themselves as underdogs, and we have to kind of nurture that from day one and get them in grade 9 and 10 and get them connected with different people, caring adults in the building, so that they can kind of grow their leadership. I'm a big believer in, like, you have to practice these things. You have to practice service to others, and seek for meaning, something beyond just money, or something beyond yourself. And I think for a lot of kids, they want to help other people, they just don't know how sometimes. They want to be a part of something bigger than themselves. So they just need they need to know how to go about doing it. I also think that for a lot of kids, it helps them to connect with other kids who have similar values. It's almost like there's a conspiracy of kids who want to be nice kids, but it's sometimes it's not considered to be kind of cool, right? So I
Mm,
remember this. We have these student recognition awards assemblies where the teachers nominate kids for different things, and one of the things they nominate them for is character. And I remember there was this one student who got an award, and I said to him, I said, I know you got this award, congratulations, but don't worry, I won't tell anyone. You're still a badass, right? So because he knows what I was talking about. He knew exactly what I was talking about. He kind of said that, again, it's one of those things, like they don't want to be in high school. You want to be doing good things, but you don't want to be singled out as, oh, you're the good student, right? So
yeah.
well, it's nice. So you kind of go through the back door or through the side door to help recognize the good qualities in kids. So
I love that. I love that. Yeah, I remember in high school, like as you mentioned, you're either the nice kid or the cool kid, or like part of you're definitely grouped by in certain categories. And it's interesting that you mentioned. I like that you mentioned that to that student. Because you mentioned it, I'm curious to learn what your take is on the role of uh, I guess recognizing and like things like awards and stuff. What role does that have in the journey of a young person at a school? I remember in my school we had this honor system, and if you get a certain grade, you get first class honors, second class honors, and that would be a very would have this big ceremony for people that did get honors, and it was just a whole at some point it felt very toxic, and if you weren't part of that group, you felt very like your self-esteem was pretty low, I'd say. So curious to learn what your thoughts are, what your take is on that.
I think you got to recognize kids every day, whether formally or informally, for the stuff that they're doing. Even naming and noticing
Mm.
great things that they do. Like, even we had some students who there was a 100-year-old man who was walking in front of the school, and he fell, and some students went and helped him and called paramedics. and
Well,
and we recognize that, because what, that is what we want our grads to do. So we don't, it's true that some of the kids who achieve high marks, obviously they get recognized, but we need to really kind of name and notice all the things that kids are doing for other kids or for people in the community, We had a number of kids who organized our leadership group. They organized a soccer tournament for grade fives, and they did an
Nice.
amazing job. So it's one of those things where uh, we have to kind of give them the feedback in the moment when they do things. And we have a group at school called Apple Crew, and they do a lot of great things for the school. But the reason they came about was because they wanted to improve the tone of the school. So I
Mm.
tried to support them as much as I could.
No, I love that, and I like that you talk about like recognizing it's not only like academics, but it's things like those students helping that 100-year-old man, right? Or things outside of class that really gives young people to shine in what they're good at versus being someone that you're not necessarily just for the recognition. So I appreciate you saying that. Obviously, I was reading through your school's website, and I know. One of your mottos is letting knowledge flourish. What does that mean, and what does that mean to you specifically? Yeah.
Well, I think with young people, I think, and even with staff, I think the first thing is self-knowledge. So when you kind of begin to know who you are, I think you can make connections with others, and you kind of know what you want, what your goals are, and that takes a long time. That's an ongoing process. So I think that and then there's of course curricular knowledge. But then there's also knowledge about, the world, right? And what's happening in the world. So I think that there's lots of different ways that you can define what that means. The flourishing part is making sure that everyone has access to that knowledge and everyone has opportunities to develop themselves as much as they can, because ultimately you're looking at the generation of tomorrow. These people will be
Mm-hmm.
running your society. They'll be parents, they'll be leaders, they'll be doing all the kinds of things to solve problems, complex problems that beset us. So I think that it's really important to give kids not only opportunities in class, but also opportunities in the community and outside of class to develop their knowledge and knowledge of the world, of the community, of people who are not like them, right? So
Yeah.
high school is one of those rare opportunities where you're with people who are very different than you, and have different perspectives, different upbringings, different religious backgrounds, and you get to have exposure and have conversations. We have to kind of help teach them how to have those conversations with each other.
Mm.
That's sort of a lost art. So I talk a lot about something my wife has talked to me about, where psychologists have talked about shift. So sometimes when you're talking to someone, they're asking you questions, and or you want to get to know someone, but you think that the way to do that is to talk about your experience, but really the best response is to continue to ask some more questions, because it's not about shifting the focus onto you. It's about getting to know them in a really deep way. It's a tough thing to do,
Mm.
because you think that by shifting it to you, you're going to connect with them. But really, it's really about, if you really want to probe deeply, you just keep asking them more questions. And I think it's a great way to get to know people.
No, you're so right. And that's why I love podcasting as well, right? Like you get the opportunity to ask as many questions and really get to know someone on a deeper level in a way that you wouldn't necessarily have when you're just having a normal one-on-one, right? So
Right.
I love that you said conversations are have become a lost art, right? Uh where does tell me more about that, and I guess how do you make conversation not a lost art in a school setting?
I think, you know what, it's practice. I think, and I think also sometimes you have to have some kind of ground rules, or norms, whatever you want to call them. But you need to have ways of because conversation can go in a lot of different ways, and or learning to agree to disagree, and then there's different kind of standards that you can have. But if you're just trying to understand the other person's perspective, then it does require some discipline and some ground rules, because Obviously, we all have a place that we're coming from, and someone might say something that might be very foreign and different from from our comfort zone, but nevertheless, for that person, it's their truth, it's their personal
Yeah.
truth and experience, right? So it's about kind of practicing listening and imaginatively putting yourself in the shoes of the other person and their perspective, right, over and over again. It
Yeah.
helps you. I think it just it helps you to appreciate, that there's so many different ways of looking at things.
Yeah, no, you're so right, and I think now more than ever, where we live in a world that feels very polarizing, it's
Mm-hmm.
important that we learn how do you sit in a room and have a conversation with someone you disagree with, right, or someone that doesn't necessarily come from the same background as you, and so I think it's extremely important, especially now more than ever. Um, I know you folks really emphasize on this idea of second chances. Can you recall, I guess, a moment or a story in your career as an educator where you've, I guess, given a young person a second chance, or have had a second chance on your own in terms of the work that you've done?
I would say, a lot of our team at our school, we really believe in working with students to try to give them opportunities that maybe, like, how I was talking about underdogs earlier, right? So sometimes students will come to us and whether it's a superintendent transfer or if they've gotten in trouble at another school, and we meet with them, we don't get into that. We basically introduce them to all of our support people. We get them their timetable, and we let them be a part of the community. We try to get them to connect with the community as much as possible. And we've done that over and over and over again with many, many students. We've had a lot of success. I think a big part of that is you get to know the students, and we do that by like 3 times a day. When the kids arrive, we welcome them when they come in the door. And then at lunch, we try not to book meetings, so we go out and we supervise the kids, we talk to the kids at lunch. And then after school, we go out the third time. A lot of our kids leave through the main foyer, so we're out there again. So we try to make ourselves more accessible. So that's how we connect with the kids, and check in with them. We always ask them, "Are you good? How are things going? How's your semester going?" Because you kind of have to be relentless in asking for feedback about, and that's where the kids will tell you, "I need to talk to you about this," or "This is going well," or "That's not going so well," or whatever, right? So you got to be kind of out there and approachable, because you don't want to be stuck in the office, right? It's not good.
Yeah.
It's not good, right?
Yeah, and I feel like when you give those opportunities to have those organic conversations outside the classroom setting, as you say, like when they're leaving, you're physically there. You're providing a space for them to come and share, and it's so important. And even like the relationships that I had with my teachers, it was in those moments during break, during lunch, right after school, where I had the chance to build a relationship with them and get to know them outside of that role that they're playing in our classroom setting. So, no, I completely agree with you on that point.
Yeah, I mean,
Um, yeah,
yeah, I was just gonna add to that. I would say as well that I think a lot of times when teachers create really interesting lessons and experiences, and sometimes those are outside of school, that's where you really get to know, you really get to know the students, and the students really get to know you, right? So,
yeah. No, 100%. Yeah. I'm curious to learn for your role, obviously, in a leadership position. You definitely have to, I guess, balance your relationship with the teachers, their students, their parents. What's been your approach with balancing and navigating all these different relationships? Because I'm sure you have to play a different role in those different contexts. So how do you approach that?
well, I guess, and I don't want this to sound like patronizing or anything, but the teachers are kind of like your class, right? So you have to get to know them, you have to know their strengths, you have to know how to support them, you have to ask for feedback, you have to acknowledge your own mistakes and own them. And you have to earn their respect, and it takes time, right? It doesn't happen overnight. At the same time, you are advocating for students. So sometimes things are going to be done. The students come first, in my view. You can't ignore their feedback. You want, obviously, the teachers are the ones who have the most direct influence and
Mm,
spend the most time with the students. But at the same time, that there have, if you're talking about policies and procedures and good teaching and so on, you kind of are like, you're tough on the message, but you're gentle on the people. So
mm,
you try and you use patience as a weapon, because some teachers who have been doing something for a long time don't realize that maybe what they're doing is harmful, right? So they need to come to a different understanding eventually, and realize you want them to kind of reflect on their practice, and talk to other teachers as well. We, as a group, as a profession, we don't get together and talk enough about teaching. So, John Hattie talks a lot about this, right? So when we give teachers opportunities to talk about their practice and their craft in very
mm,
explicit ways, I think our teaching moves forward. I know my own teaching moved forward when I had opportunities to kind of teach with someone else. And then I would say, okay, I'm going to try this period two. You try period four. We'll talk about it, right?
makes sense.
So, you're kind of coaching each other into better teaching, and you're taking into account the differences between your classes, but even still, because it's a very lonely profession, right? So the more you can kind of do professional development with each other every day, the better. But yeah, you have to balance those things, because if you put students on top to the exclusion of everything that the teachers want, you'll alienate all the teachers.
Mm,
If you please the teachers at the expense of the students, you'll lose the school. So you have to find that balance, and you also have to make sure that you are following the policies of the OCT, the Ontario College of Teachers, as well as your board policies as well. I mean, that you're employed by an employer, right? So you have to
yeah.
make sure those things are done too, right? So,
Makes sense. Yeah, and I'm sure over time, like with experience, that sort of you sort of build that muscle of sort of navigating that balance. I really like what you said about uh, as a teacher, you are also you're a student in that sense in terms of learning from your
yeah.
peers and adapting, right? I what I really liked about something that on your school's website that was mentioned was being culturally responsive and adaptive in your teaching practices. Why is that important? And can you share, I guess, an example of what that actually looks like?
Well, I guess, like, one of the things that we asked our teachers to be, we've been working on this for a number of years, but I really looked at, as part of the process of getting to know your students, you need to know that they're coming from different cultural backgrounds, different religious backgrounds, and different perspectives, because, like, we're a very diverse school. And so you want to make sure that, not only are the resources and whatever it is, the novels, the examples you're giving are not all Eurocentric, that there's diversity there, that people can see success, they can see themselves in terms of success, and what's been achieved in terms of achievements in the subject area. But I also think that you know, getting to know people and being flexible and being adaptive, and negotiating sometimes with kids, and learning from your students, because your students are always teaching you things. It's just whether or not you're paying attention, right? Like, your students are
Mm,
always teaching you something, and behavior is always communicating something to you. But are you clued in, or are you kind of just so focused on the curriculum, right? Or
yeah,
whatever super lesson you're trying to deliver, that you're not
yeah.
really hearing where they're at. So it's kind of meeting kids where they're at each day, and realizing that it's not all about you. I remember an administrator saying, "It's not about you, Mike. It's about right, and that's so true, right? And so even in the classroom, it's not about you. It's I mean, you can do direct teaching, you can do explicit instruction, but at the end of the day, you want to make sure that the kids who are probably the least advantaged are doing really amazingly well, because the other kids, they don't need you. They'll do well
Yeah.
with, they'll do well in spite of you. But it's, can you get the kids who are maybe not as strong and don't have as many advantages doing really well, and the ones who are the least engaged? If those kids are really doing well and they're on fire by the end of your courses, that's to me, that's the true measure of whether or not you're a good teacher, I think.
No, no, you're right. It's I love that you mentioned this whole idea of it's not about you. I do a lot of speaking, obviously, and something that I always remind myself before going on stage is thinking about reminding myself that it's not about you. You're here to serve, right?
Mhm.
Because as a teacher, you're also speaking in front of a class, and sometimes it's so easy to make it about yourself, and so going in the mindset of you're here to serve and it's about the audience and the students in this situation, it really one reduces that pressure and takes out that pressure, but also allows you to really listen and engage with your audience or your classroom. Yeah. um, I I know you've obviously been in this space for a while. I'm curious to learn how you've seen things evolved over the last 30 or so years. What are the types of challenges that you have to, I guess, face today versus a bunch of years ago? How have you seen the space evolve as an educator?
Wow, that's a big question. I would say that, I would say that, back, I would say when I started out, there probably was a lot more trust in the institutions, including
Mm,
teachers. And I think, over time, there's been a bit of an erosion of that. And so everything is being questioned and, second guessed and so on. So that's something that, you have to deal with now, that people are not, they're more skeptical. I think that we have to earn our professionalism every day.
mm,
It's not taken for granted because you have your name, you are a teacher, that people will see you automatically as a professional. They'll kind of see, well, what are your practices? How do I know you're professional, right? So I think it's important for people to, have really good practices, and to make sure that they conduct themselves appropriately with their students, and that they embody the OCT standards and the ethical standards, and that that they're in their interactions with students, and not just the students in their classes, but the students in the school at large,
mm.
in ways like, treat people the way you want to be treated. Like, if these kids were your kids in another school, how would you want them to be treated? So
Yeah.
that's really, really important, because you know, kids really, they weigh and consider your words depending on your positional authority. So if you're a
Mm,
teacher and you're really nasty to some student that you don't know, they'll remember that. They will remember how they were treated. And even in these roles, it's important to to take a low key, because people think, well, the principal's talking to me, right? So, or the vice principal's talking to me. So, or the guidance counselor's talking to me.
yeah.
So they almost see your position before they hear your words, right? So
Mm,
I think you have to be really careful and measure how you talk to people, because I think you could do a lot of unintentional damage based
yeah.
on being really, thoughtless and careless with your speech.
Makes sense. No. Why do you think that trust in institutions has decreased over time? Like, what do you think has caused that?
I know that, probably the pandemic had an effect, but even before that, I think there was a lot of, there were a lot of uh, different perspectives on public education, on its value and utility, and its cost. it is a very expensive thing, along with healthcare. It uses up a lot of provincial budgets, so I think people are looking, for results, and maybe for some people, they didn't feel that they were getting the desirable results out of our
Mm,
grads. So I think it's pretty complex, but I definitely, um, I definitely think that we have to definitely work at earning um, I guess our place, because I think that, especially after the pandemic, I think people, including teachers and all of us, we do have a level of, I shouldn't really speak for everyone, but I would just say from my perspective, I see that the level of anxiety out there is pretty high. So
yeah.
I think that sometimes we're trying to manage our own anxiety and the anxiety of our
Still,
clients, right?
yeah.
So, and their families, right? So we have to, the relationship piece, the sense of belonging piece, getting to know people, that's huge, right?
Yeah.
That's huge, because that's what creates the trust, right? So
Yeah.
people kind
No,
of want to
that
know,
yeah.
we can trust these people, right? So,
Yeah. No, it makes sense. It makes sense. I guess we're almost out of time here. One final question I have for you is, um, if you had to go back to year one of you being an educator, what advice would you give your younger self that was just starting out in this space?
hmm. I would say, you know, well, first of all, I want to acknowledge I want to acknowledge my wife, because my wife Kelly has been a huge influence on me in terms of that servant leadership. She works in the retirement industry,
Mm,
and she goes above and beyond for her clients, and she's been really my kind of cornerstone in terms of how to navigate not only teaching but also like getting into these kinds of roles. So
yeah.
I would say it's important to have a critical friend. I think it's also important to spend more time on finding as many connections as you can with your students before you get into the curriculum. I think
Mm,
that's huge. Your passion for the curriculum and the subject will only get you so far. What I think gets you further is really connecting with students and keeping that connection going, so that they will go on that journey with you. But if you don't get to know them and they don't get to know you, then it's only going to get you so far. So I would say that spend more time intentionally in those areas.
yeah, I think definitely throughout the podcast, I think a big theme has been, connection and people and relationships and even just going back to earlier, like, having conversations and getting to know people on a deeper level, which, as you say, it is a lost art, especially in a world where we feel so connected with social media, but we're more disconnected than ever before, right? So, I really appreciate you taking out the time. I feel very inspired. I feel hopeful knowing that, students have educators like you that go above and beyond to create an environment that they can thrive in. And I appreciate you, taking out the time and sharing a couple stories with me on the podcast.
Oh, thanks, Jan. I appreciate the opportunity. I think you had some excellent questions, and it's good that we're kind of just practicing, what we're saying we need to do more, which is kind of get to know each other. And it's a real privilege to be able to do this podcast. So thank you.